Ladies and gentlemen, Khanuman va Ağayan, good afternoon from Scotland. A very warm welcome to the keynote address of the Tudeh party at 80 online conference. My name is Siavosh Ranjbar Daimi, and I'm lecturer in Middle Eastern history at the University of St. Andrews, and I'm the initial co-organizer of this conference, together with Leonard Michael, who is currently a doctoral candidate at the School of History at the University of St. Andrews. The year 2021, 1400 in the Persian year, which has just started a week ago, is a very important one in terms of anniversaries pertaining to modern Iranian history. In August 1941, the Allied forces invaded Iran. A few weeks later, the Tudeh party of Iran, the Iranian left's foremost political formation of the 20th century, was founded. This conference appears to be possibly the first one organized in a Western university which focuses on the Tudeh party of Iran from a strictly academic standpoint. For those familiar with British cuisine, the Tudeh party is the Marmite of Iranian politics. It is either admired or hated, with little in between. In 6 months' time, as we said, the Tudeh party of Iran, which formally still exists, will enter the 80th year of its activities. For the majority of these years, the Tudeh has featured as an exile party. It has only been able to conduct significant activity inside Iran for only 16 of these years, between 1941 and 53, and between 1979 and 1983. It has been forced into exile by both pre- and post-revolutionary state systems in the remainder of these past 8 decades. The Tudeh's influence within the Iranian public sphere looms large, however. From trailblazers of the arts, literature, and theater to Pahlavi-era cabinet ministers, through to military officers and pioneers of graphic design or architecture, the influence of those who at some point in their political and personal lives were either Tudeh party members or sympathizers extend to many walks of life of the Iranian 20th century. Yet many aspects of the party's long history have remained unexplored within the sphere of academic research. For the next 3 days, this academic conference will offer an extensive set of talks on various aspects of the party's involvement in the Iranian public scene. We are particularly pleased to have assembled a program which matches the call for papers' intention to bring about a cross-generational set of talks with an inclination on aspects of the party's history which have been subject to little or no academic scrutiny. This conference is bilingual, with a majority of talks delivered in English, but a significant amount presented in Persian. We are delighted that our colleagues from universities in Iran have responded positively to our call for papers and have brought about an avenue for academic collaboration in these very challenging times. We would like to remind our audience that this is a strictly academic conference, which will offer a gamut of opinions and conclusions on the conduct of the Tudeh party. It will not offer an exhaustive or complete account of the party's multifaceted history, though. We would also like to emphasize that the organizers do not endorse any view or opinion expressed during the conference, but look forward to healthy and robust academic debate on all topics covered during the next few days. I would also like to mention that this conference was made possible through the help of our student volunteer organizing team, composed of Claudia Baldelli, Anya Eck, Thomas Halvorsen, and Evelyn Solihi. We are truly grateful for their efforts in the past few months to bring this conference together. Now, without further ado, I will pass the virtual microphone to Professor Ali Ansari, founding director of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of St. Andrews, who has kindly agreed to chair this keynote session.
Thank you very much, Siavosh, and a very, very warm welcome to you all to this Institute of Iranian Studies conference on the Tudeh party of Iran at 80. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome Ervand Abrahamian, who's going to give us our keynote lecture this evening, or at least this evening in Scotland. I think it's probably lunchtime where he is, but Ervand really does need no introduction. But really he is, as far as I'm concerned, the historian's historian. And what I mean by that is whenever we all go around writing something, we always tend to go and see what Ervand has said beforehand, just to check to make sure we've got things right. He's the author of many books, including obviously Iran Between Two Revolutions, Modern Iran, Khomeiniism, and a book that I found particularly useful in my own work, Tortured Confessions. He's also written a number of extremely important and certainly in my view, and I use every bit of British understatement here, you wouldn't hear me say this normally, but truly seminal articles, I think, in the history of modern Iran. So it's a great, great pleasure to welcome him here. He is distinguished professor of history at Baruch College and the graduate school at the City University in New York. Before we get started and I hand over to Ervand, I ought to also very briefly introduce our four panelists who will be engaging in discussion with him afterwards. The discussion will follow his 45-minute or so lecture, and then afterwards we will open to general questions. So we have, and I'll make this regrettably brief, but I would have liked to have talked at great length about all of you, but as I warned you, probably a sentence each. Nasser Mohajer is an independent scholar of modern Iranian history, currently in Paris. Stephanie Cronin is Elahe Omidjar Mirjaloli Research Fellow at St. Andrews College, Oxford, and a member of the Faculty of Oriental Studies. Touraj Atabaki is Senior Researcher at the International Institute of Social History and Professor Emeritus. He holds the Chair of Social History of the Middle East and Central Asia at Leiden University. And last but by no means least, my good old friend Afshin Matin-Asgari, who is outstanding Professor of Middle East History at California State University in Los Angeles, which is undoubtedly warmer than it is here. However, I'm very pleased to say that the sun is shining in London, which is good news indeed, and we ought to enjoy it for as long as it lasts. I've given away the fact, of course, that I'm not in Scotland at the moment, but that's the joy of webinars. Anyway, before I go on any further, I shall hand over now to Ervand. Ervand, the floor is yours. Very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Ali. My question I want to address is basically, how does one explain the Tudeh party becoming such a mass movement or a social movement? And look at it as if one was looking at the Chartist movement in England in the 19th century. How does one explain the growth of something into a mass movement pretty quickly? And with Iran, it's especially intriguing because, of course, the Tudeh party was inevitably associated with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was associated with Russia, and Russia was, in fact, seen as the national enemy of Iran from the time of really Catherine the Great. So here you have a party that is seen as often as a tool or an ally of the national enemy. Yet despite this disadvantage, especially at a time of nationalism, it manages to grow within a few years into a mass movement. And the main basis of the movement, of course, is urban working class and intelligentsia. And the two areas where you see the working class strength is, of course, in the oil industry and in the Central Council of Trade Unions that reach a peak basically in 1946 and again in 1952-53. And if you look at these arenas, especially the oil Khuzestan area, you see that even from the British archives, that the two-day labor unions were really the key organizations in the oil industry. They report basically that the oil industry was under the control of the functioning control of the Tudeh party in 1946 and again in 1951 during the oil nationalization crisis. And you also see the Central Council of Trade Unions growing outside the oil industry, of course, in any area that was modern industry, in textiles in Isfahan, for example, or in small factories up in the Caspian. So clearly there is no dispute that the working class was very much organized by the Tudeh, and rival organizations that were created, like the Zahmat Keshan party and the government trade unions, yellow unions, usually were created just to undermine the Tudeh unions, and they withered away when the government stopped supporting them. With the intelligentsia, it's even equally striking that during this period, 1941-53, if you look at the roster of well-known writers in Iran, they're almost all either members of the Tudeh party or very close to the Tudeh party at some point or other. Derogatory, people would call them fellow travelers. This was a Cold War term, but for various reasons, they associated and supported the Tudeh party, even if they were not actual members. So if you look at the roster, some people nowadays forget it since we're almost 80 years from that period, but the roster is quite impressive of the literary figures who supported the Tudeh at some point. Bozorgar Alavi, of course, Sadegh Hedayat, Chubak, Nima, Minovi, Shamlu, Khanlari, Al-Ahmad, Eprim, Tabari, Said Nafisi, Khalil Maraki, Tavallodi, Bahar, Naderpur, Tawassoli, Beazin, Darya Bandari, Ibrahim Golestan, Dolat Abadi, Nushin, Naderpur, Meskub, Akhavan, Afghani, Afrashte, Majid Rahnema, and often forgotten, but very key person, Ahmad Morteza Kayvan. Actually, Kayvan was a key link between the Tudeh and intellectuals, and this explains why actually he was one of the first people to be executed after the 53 coup. He himself was not well known as a prominent writer, but a key figure behind and getting together doures that were literary figures. So how does one explain this basically sudden growth of the Tudeh party in the 1940s up to 53? I would propose basically 6 reasons. You could probably add more to it or try to qualify it, but I would argue there are really 6 major reasons that explains the expansion of the Tudeh party. One is most important, I would say, is that the Tudeh party is strong in its polemics, stressed the importance of class struggle. And at this time in Iran in the 1940s and 50s, people tended to see society in terms of class divisions and class conflicts. So the party basically, I can say, stress very much fitted into the discourse of the time, which was that of class analysis. So if you read polemics, not just from the Tudeh, but even anti-Tudeh writers at that time, they tend to see society in terms of class divisions. So you would find even senators describing in the Senate that, well, our al-Sultanes, our Dowlehs, our Mamaleks are not like the British aristocracy. Somehow they're different, but they still saw society, their society, as very much divided into a class. So I would say the discourse of the time in Iran was that of class politics. And Iran and the Tudeh party, you can say its own discourse fitted very well in for the national discourse of class differences. This later, of course, changed because after the 60s into the 70s, this discourse of class was really then overwhelmed by the discourse of Gharbzadegi. It's true that Al-Ahmad tried to bring in class discourse into Gharbzadegi, but the dominant, basically, language later on became that of Gharbzadegi. And then you find even royalists and even leftists using the notion of Gharbzadegi that then, in a way, I would say, overshadowed that of class differences. Now, a second reason I would say the Tudeh succeeded was that if you look at the Tudeh literature, especially in the early 40s, it sees itself as basically a continuation and support of the Mashrutiyat, of the constitutional revolution. It's surprising that if you read Mardom Mahnameh, that was the main academic journal of the time for the left, so much of the articles are about the Mashrutiyat, about basically the Enlightenment and the traditions of the early period of the 20th century. In fact, the Tudeh at that time very much saw itself as a continuation of the ideas of the Enlightenment. So you even find in Asemi's book on what the Tudeh wants and says, a stress on the notions of individual rights, individual right to think, to speak, to believe what you want. These are basic principles of the Enlightenment. And the party very much, I think, stressed in those years, as a contrast to what had happened under Reza Shah, stressed the importance of what we nowadays would call human rights, but at that time were considered the rights of individuals. Later on, some people would dismiss these as bourgeois rights, but at that time, they're very much considered as inherent rights of individuals. Also, you find if you read those journals, Mardom Mahnameh, although they have a fair amount on Soviet scholars, they have also a great deal of stuff from the West. So you have people, laudatory articles on Walter Whitman, Bernard Shaw, Stephen Spender, William Faulkner, Max Palang, on Sartre, Kafka, the existentialism, Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence, and of course, French Revolution and the encyclopedists. So they saw themselves very much in the Western tradition of enlightenment, of constitutionalism, individual rights. This type of discourse was, of course, later overwhelmed by the Arzadegi discourse again, and where people then viewed anything from the West, including the Enlightenment, as a Western disease and a Western plague that should be avoided. So this even affected some leftists who picked up the notions of Arzadegi, and in that, of course, the issue of constitutionalism and rights was pushed aside. A third reason, I would say, the Tudeh succeeded at this time. Again, if you look at the early journals and literature, is that it stresses a great deal on Iranianism, Iranian identity, without actually going into Aryanism and in fact criticizing the racial theories that had been advocated by some racial theorists in Iran, especially in the last years of Reza Shah. So you have in the journal often articles about Shahnameh, Nowruz, Mehregan, Mazdak, protest movements in the pre-Islamic Iran. These articles don't openly challenge Islam, but they do stress the distinctiveness of Iranian identity, and therefore fitted into, I would say, the concept of Iranian nationalism at the time. A fourth reason is that the party itself introduced into Iran the concept of political party organizations. Political parties before and even during their time, and I would say even nowadays, parties tend to be individualistic or personality organizations. So you have one individual creates a a circle around themselves, announces it's a party, and that organization survives as long as that leading person is around or still interested. But the Tudeh party was the first really to create a viable organization, not built around one personality. In fact, it started as very much as a collective leadership with equal members of leaders at the top, not always agreeing with each other, but being able to, on the whole, work together as an organization. And here, another thing you find with this organization is the introduction of what was often called democratic centralism, which nowadays, of course, has bad connotations of Stalinism, Leninism. But what it really meant at that time, and was important for political organizations, is that you could be a member of a party, you had a vote, you actually, power or authority went from below to up, you elected congresses, provincial assemblies, that the party Congress elected then the central committee, the central committee appointed or elected then various committees. So it was an organization where there was some semblance of democracy. Often, of course, some people were more equal than others, but it had to function within a democratic process. And this was, of course, very unique and very different from rival organizations at that time. And even nowadays, you would find it very rare to find a political party in Iran that is based on elections or a system where the leadership is beholden to membership and has to rely on elections. So in this way, you can say, however distorted democracy was, there was an element of democratic process in the party structure. This is another thing actually that often people forget when they look at the Iranian Revolution. Compared to the other major revolutions, one distinctive feature I find in the Iranian Revolution is in the Iranian Revolution, authority goes from above down. So it emanates from above down. Khomeini appoints various people. The Central Khomeini Committee appoints even the local committees and so on. Authority is really from above below. While in the other revolutions, especially the French and the Russian, authority often came from below up. So there was always this process that authority resided finally in below, whether it's in party membership or in the public. In the Iranian Revolution, I wouldn't say it goes to the culture, but it very much authority was going in the reverse direction. Here, the Tudeh party, you could say, is in a way counters that. There is always the notion, was in the notion, that people who are in the leadership should be elected there. They're not appointed there. It's not their private property that they can appoint in their successors. A fifth reason, I would say, was successful, the party was successful in this period, is that it had for the first time a relative freedom to function, to have an organization, trade unions, writers' associations, whatever. You needed some room to breathe, some room to create a structure. And this possibility came after 1941 under the occupation, and it remained a short while after that into 1947, and already there were restrictions after 47. Then in 1951, again, there was a slight opening up under Mohajer, not that the ban on the Tudeh party was lifted, but Mohajer, being a real constitutionalist, genuine strict constitutionalist, was determined that the Tudeh party should have the right to organize, if not in its own name, but through other front organizations. So, for instance, in May 1951, at the height of the oil nationalization campaign, where conservatives wanted to prevent the Tudeh party having a May Day parade, his argument was there's no reason they should be prevented from having a May Day parade, since that was a legal thing to do as long as it was peaceful. And he, in fact, adamantly insisted that they should have the right to have the parade. Similarly, with court procedures, after 47, Tudeh leaders were often carted to military courts for trials. Under Mossadegh, the notion was very much that as civilians, they should be tried in civilian courts, because that's how the constitution regulated. So there was, you can say, open ability to function from, I would say, from 41 to 47, and again from 1951 to 53. So it was the political opening that permitted really a grassroots organization to function. And this is important because social movements really cannot function unless there is some breathing space. Often sort of wild-eyed radicals think that as soon as you set up a shop and say, you know, workers of the world unite, hundreds of thousands of workers are going to rally around and join you, you really need to be able to have room to organize. And here the Tudeh party was able to do that, partly because there was some opening, but even more important, it had a cadre of labor organizers that went back to the 1920s, 1930s, who already knew people in the trade, in the working class factories, and could go back there and reorganize. So to organize labor is not a simple thing. You just can't go into a factory and tell workers, you know, we have a new party, join, here's the membership. You really have to confidence, the reputation, the tradition to be able to do that. And the Tudeh party was able to do that in 1941 because it did have some tradition from the old Communist Party in factory organizations, and also, of course, in the oil industry. So I would say that the sixth final reason for it was the tradition, or the veterans from the trade union movements from before. Often people are forgotten because these are not intellectuals, prominent figures, but they were really labor organizers, people who knew how to function in factories in the oil industry. And they had their experience from before, and they had people who trusted them from before and could therefore create such an organization. Now, from what we know from publications, Tudeh publications, newspapers at the time, British archives, some CIA documents that have come up, we know basically where the strength of the Tudeh party was, how well it was organized. What we still don't know, and this is where area for research for the future, really is what went on inside the party leadership, i.e. in central committee meetings, what issues were divided people, what issues actually were considered very prominent at the time, painful, whatever. Because we don't have access to these internal documents, this is area we need a lot of research. And hopefully, as party documents are opened up, we will be able to get actually access to some very important issues that really went on inside. We still don't know what it was from outside, because obviously what was published outside didn't necessarily reflect everything that went on inside. And here where I think a question of polemics or politics comes in, and one has to be very sort of, I think, more academic about it. It's easy to go through private documents and try to find dirt. We're not looking for dirt. We're trying to look for what are the issues really that divided people. I have a good friend from Trinidad, and I asked him what he once thought about Naipaul, who was also from Trinidad. His answer was very pertinent. He says Naipaul is very successful in Britain because he goes around basically in the third world collecting collecting shit. Any shit he could collect about the third world, he could preserve it and present it to the West to show that there was something wrong with the third world. Similarly, one shouldn't be able to eagerly go around in private sources to try to find any dirt, basically, that exists, but try to discover actually real issues that existed inside the party. I would be very interested, for instance, to find out what were the discussions when suddenly the Soviets asked for the oil concession in the north. This has become, of course, a very political issue because people in the West claim this is what started off the Cold War, the Soviet demand for oil concession in the north. This took also the Tudeh party by surprise. So we'd like to know actually what discussions took place within the party and how people reacted, who was siding with side. Incidentally, I think the Cold War interpretation of the Western interpretation of Cold War is again wrong in saying the Cold War started with the Soviet demand for the oil concession. Actually, what preceded that was the American and British attempt to get oil concessions in Azerbaijan. It was that leaking of that secret negotiations that led to the Soviets to demand the concession in the north. Kennan, who is no friend of the Soviet Union, actually, in one of his reports from Washington, from Moscow, reported that it was the bad behavior of the Western companies that, in fact, sparked off Stalin's demand for oil in the north. A second issue that is worth actually investigating, which is related to, of course, the Azerbaijan issue, is the creation of a Ferqe Demokrat. We have some inkling from writings, especially by Ovanesyan, that this again took the Tudeh more than by surprise. They were outraged by that act, and how the Central Committee reacted and what they wrote to Moscow would be very interesting for really in the history of the Tudeh party. Another topic that would be really worth investigating, we don't know much about, we have inklings of, is what was the relationship really between some of the Tudeh leaders and Rouzbeh, when Rouzbeh was not formally a member of the Tudeh party. And this is, of course, the time when Rouzbeh carried out the assassination of Mohamed Massoud, which is more like a Blanquist action rather than a Marxist action. But it would be informative to know whether any party leaders had any contact with Rouzbeh at the time when he was not formally under party discipline and even party member. Another topic that I would be very interested is what discussions went on in the leadership about policy towards Mossadegh from not just in the last period, because we know enough about 52, 53, but from 1949 to 51. What were the arguments for or against supporting Mosaddegh? Who sided on which side on these arguments? Often that what has been published about divisions in the Tudeh party is usually boiled down to, well, it was personality rivalries or factionalism. Somehow Iran is supposed to be very susceptible to factionalism. Sure, there was factionalism, but how much this factionalism was based on ideas, principles, or not? I would hazard the guess that once we get the information from internal sources, that these issues were really serious issues. These people took ideas very seriously, policies very seriously, whether they were right or wrong. It wasn't just egos of people's egos that were clashing. It was really policy differences that were very important. And how and who was on what side, we still don't know, because what is published about it for external purposes is still kept basically undercover, under closed documents. So I'll end up by saying that there's a lot, I think we know enough about the Tudeh party as a social movement, but what happened in internal politics of the Tudeh party still remains to be investigated. And we will hopefully be able to look at it in years to come in a more fruitful way. We have the advantage of hindsight, of course. Two, we'll hopefully have the advantage of new sources. And a third advantage you'd have is that with time, of course, whether it's 80 years or 40 years, one can be more detached from the arguments and the emotions of the early period from the 40s and 50s, and we have a more of an academic, intellectual, analysis of what went on in this period. And instead of sitting in judgment, using history as a judge or even a hanging judge, we'll be able to actually fathom what went on inside the party during these crucial times, especially crucial times of crisis such as 1951, 53. And of course, you can argue the same things fast forward in 1978, 79, 1980. So I'll stop there and leave it for the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ervand. Wonderful. You know, really, for me anyway, personally, very intriguing and interesting to see that connection, as you said, with the with some of the ideas of the constitutional movement and obviously the Enlightenment, which is something that I'm particularly interested in. So we're now going to move on to our first panelist for her comments. So Stephanie, I think it's over to you first, and then we'll move over. I think and then we'll move over to Nasser. So Stephanie, over to you for any comments, thoughts, questions.
Thank you. Yes, I was also interested by what Ervand said about the Tudeh as locating itself within the tradition of the Enlightenment, because it seems to me that this is also something which has often been neglected in histories of the left, that leftist movements generally, especially if you go back to the 19th century, did see themselves as inheriting the legacy of the Enlightenment. There was not then the kind of rather different view of the meaning of the Enlightenment that we have now, which is much more qualified to see the Enlightenment something much more problematic. But if you look at the literature produced by leftist organizations around the world in the late 19th century, up until maybe the 1920s and 1930s, it does see itself this way. It sees itself, and this is another word that we are a little careful with now, but it sees itself as a vehicle of progress. not progress in the kind of imperial sense, but that change for the better could be brought about, and that was not a utopian idea, but that was something that you could actually work towards. So progress and secularism as well, these very important ideas, which I think the Tudeh inherited in the 1940s, and then which became a little bit compromised later on. So I think that's quite an interesting dimension to see the Tudeh as inheriting the mantle of the constitutional movement, and to see that more clearly. The other comment, really, I just have one more comment, is to do with when we look at the 1940s, I think it's quite interesting to place this success of the Tudeh party within again a global context, because this is the Second World War. The prestige of the Soviet Union was enormous around the world. So everywhere around the world, communist parties were leading the resistance to occupation, whether it's Germans, Italians, Japanese, but the communist parties were at the forefront. And communist parties everywhere undergo and experience a huge expansion in membership. So the Tudeh party is part of a global trend in that respect. And I think some of the reasons would apply elsewhere as well. So the question of the context of the war is quite important. And it's not just the prestige of the Soviet Union, but it's also the lack of opposition from the British in Iran. Because again, the foremost objective of the British was to defeat Nazism. In order to do that, again, around the world, they made alliances with communist parties. You know, we have these old stories, which everyone knows in the UK, about British partisan drops to Tito in Yugoslavia. And, you know, we're very proud of this. And if you look at wartime footage, you see up until at least 1943, the alliance with the Soviet Union was seen in a very positive light. And it's really, you know, not 1946, you can sense, again, in terms of the British attitude in Iran to the Tudeh, a cooling after the victory at Stalingrad. Because after that, it's really clear that the Soviet Union is the principal power defeating the Germans. And I think from that point on, the British start to think about the post-war period. And there's a real cooling in terms of how they see the Tudeh, because the Soviet Union is no longer defensive, but it's actually on the offensive. And that this is when you get all the irresistible demands for a second front opening up. So having said that was my last comment, I'll just make another last comment, which is I wonder, again, what Ervand thinks, the extent to which our view of the Tudeh in this period in the 1940s, which is, as presented, is quite a positive one. To what extent has this been distorted by the polemics which arose in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of the New Left? Because the New Left, again, everywhere, was so hostile to pro-Soviet communist parties that, again, the New Left intellectuals would go around searching for negativity. So I wonder to what extent that's actually distorted our view of this period.
Thanks, Ervand. Do you want to take that last point, address that last point now, or save them for when I collect the others?
I'll take it now, because I might get to the British policy actually during the war was quite, you can say, tolerant of the Tudeh party for pragmatic reasons. I mean, part of what you mentioned is the need for the Soviet Union, but they also needed the the industry to function. So they actually, the labor attaché makes it quite clear that they don't want labor problems in the oil industry. And he, at one point, I noticed they would say, well, a lot of the British officials, they're actually communists, but they're not going to cause trouble because as long as the war is there, they have a reason for supporting basically Britain. Similarly, they work closely with the Tudeh in Isfahan, for instance, in the elections, 14 Majlis elections. The British consul, brought together conservatives and the Tudeh to divide up the seats in the Majlis. And this was, again, I think, part of the policy of alliance. There was also a party created, the Hamrahan Party, the Comrades Party, that was clearly pro-British, but also very left socialistic, and worked with the Tudeh Party at that time. And this also later on gave this paranoid image that the Tudeh Party was actually a British conspiracy. Why else were the British supporting the Tudeh during this period without taking it in the context of what the pragmatic reasons were? So there is that, it's very complicated about at one time the relationship with the British and the Tudeh. The new left policy issue, it's not surprising, because by the 1960s, you have a new generation of leftists in Europe, West, and they usually see their fathers as having failed. And it was similarly with Iran, that the Tudeh Party was identified with the father's generation, the old generation. They had failed, and therefore often it was easy to put the failure on the Tudeh Party, and they usually repeated, in the new left in the West, repeated what ultra-leftists in Iran criticized the Tudeh Party about, without really knowing what had happened in Iran. It was much more a sort of knee-jerk reaction of picking up similar criticisms. But the question of Stalinism, of course, it was always there, and it's not in a way surprising, but if you look at as soon as Khrushchev denounced Stalin, the Tudeh Party was actually had a lot of stuff at that time in its journal Donya about victims of Stalin, the Iranian victims of Stalin. So they weren't shying away from that. I mean, some of the leaders like Mohajer Gharavi had relatives who were killed by Stalin. So they weren't really so much contaminated by the Stalinist past, which Western communist parties were. So the discourse was somewhat different.
It's one of the interesting developments, certainly of the war years, is the fact that we know that many elements of the British military, and certainly those who would have been maybe part in the occupation in Iran at that time, had already shifted their political allegiances to Labour, I think, by that stage. So it would have been quite interesting to see what sort of associations I think people on the ground may have had, and they may have been somewhat surprised to see some of the views coming from British soldiers, certainly on the ground. At that time would have been much more sympathetic. Nasser, over to you. I think you're muted, Nasser. You're muted.
Okay, let me start with thanking Ervand for his very interesting talk and very keen observations, as usual. Just wanted to add something to what he said about the social movements. I'm sure that the time considerations that did not permit Ervand to bring this issue out. Like the Tudeh Party of Iran was very instrumental in organizing a mass women's movement, and this is the Tashkilat Demokratik Zanan Iran first, that was created by the Tudeh Party sympathizers. I mean, it was their own initiative, and they asked, the Tudeh Party if they could, initiate and organize this, political party that they created, and was playing a very important role, even after the Tudeh Party was announced to be illegal. They played a very important role, in in the bringing this notion of women's rights in Iran. And, what happened later on, in the 40s with the Shah's White Revolution, one cannot explain, the developments then without, the very important, very massive, very profound campaign that the Tashkilat Zanan Iran and later on Sazaman Zanan Iran, the National Organization of Iranian Women, that Ashraf Pahlavi, by the way, took the name of Sazaman Zanan Iran from the Tudeh party after late 1940s, early 1950s. So this is one thing. The other one is the student movement. The Tudeh party had a lot of influence in the student movement of the time, especially the University of Tehran. And we know that no other organization before the creation of the National Front was, having such a influence amongst the students. And we know that, many students were recruited from, many party members were recruited from student ranks. So I just wanted to add to these two social movements to what Ervand very beautifully and nicely laid out. And I have a question with regard to what Ervand said about Ruzbeh. As far as I know, there was no even doubt. I mean, nobody believed that, Ruzbeh was involved in the assassination of Mohammad Massoud at the time. I mean, the two martial courts of Mohammad Massoud, of Khosrow Ruzbeh, they never brought up the issue of, Khosrow Ruzbeh and his assassination by Mohammad Massoud and his assassination by Khosrow Ruzbeh. The issue came out first, as far as I know, in the fourth plenum in exile in 1957. This is when, they started, talking about this. And we know that, Khosrow Ruzbeh was arrested, during the fourth plenum. And this is when, for the first time, this issue came to the fore. And they were talking about, his engagement after the Azmude talked about, Khosrow Ruzbeh as person who was the mastermind of the assassination of Khosrow Ruzbeh. So I would like Ervand to talk a little about this important point that you raised. Have you seen documents? Have you seen, things in the Nami Mardom in Dunya before the fourth plenum, 1957 fourth plenum, somehow alluding to or indicating the role of Khosrow Ruzbeh in this plot? Because by all indications, I have not come to this conclusion myself, reading, all this documents, available documents that Khosrow Ruzbeh had a part in that plot. And it seems that this is something that the Bakhtiyar made up in terms of, because everybody in Tehran was talking about Ashraf Pahlavi and the court being behind this assassination. And they had to find, someone to blame, for this assassination. And it seems that, later on they decided that, well, the most important person and the best target, is Khosrow Ruzbeh. He was very, better, well known, for, all his endeavors in terms of, escaping jail, in terms of, having such an influence, amongst the military organization of the Tudeh party and so on and so forth. So I don't want to take much of your time. Thank you.
Over to you, Ervand. I think that's a very clear question there.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we need to actually have more internal documents. At that time, of course, the usual suspect was Ashraf, and the British embassy even thought that. But there is problem is that in Rouzbeh's confession, he does admit it. So if this was all made up, well, you would imagine that the Tudeh party leaders would deny it and say it's a forced confession, this is not true. But again, I'd love to know what discussions there were. My impression is that Rouzbeh was a bit of a loose cannon. He may have been a hero and so on, but he was also somewhat of sort of erratic. And at that time, he could have very well done it on his own with a few of his colleagues. He also carried out some assassinations later on. So it's not he was averse to assassinating when he thought someone deserved it. So I would, I wouldn't dismiss the possibility that he did it. But whether he had any connections with the Tudeh party, which the government, of course, claimed he had, is, I think, doubtful. At that time, he was not, there was no military organization, and he was not a member. The only question is, did he have personal, informal ties with anyone in the leadership, especially Kianuri? But that would be interesting to find out. About the women's organization, actually, you raise a very important issue because, of course, later on, the discourse about women's rights becomes very predominant in Iranian politics. Here, I would say, on a formal basis, of course, the Tudeh party had a lot of stress on women's organizations, women's basically rights, even the right to vote. Again, compared to other parties, even other secular parties, it had a much better progressive stand. But I'm reluctant to talk about women's movement because it's not an autonomous movement. Usually, if you look at the women's organizations, people leading them are basically sisters or wives of Tudeh leaders. And the organizations already support organizations rather than organizations of their own. So I don't feel, it's not really part of a trade union movement. You can say it had autonomous interests and activities. It was very much, I would say, subordinate. But of course, compared to other parties at that time, the Tudeh, you can say, is much more progressive on the women's issue. But even in the 1980s, you find astounding statements by Mariam Firouz. Here, she is someone who's been active on political since the 40s, someone of her own stature. And when some journalist asks her about a political question, she says, oh, I don't deal with political questions, ask Kia. So it's clearly, she even submitted to the males in terms of political decisions. So I would say, when you're talking about women's movement in Iran, it really doesn't start until after 79, so after the crackdown about the veil by Khomeini. Then you can talk about real women's organizations, autonomous from organizations that are male-led organizations.
Thank you. Now, who's next? I think it's Touraj. I think it's over to you now.
Thanks to Siavush, thanks to Ali. It's a great to be in a panel as a discussant, commenting on presentation of your mentor and supervisor. When I was doing my PhD, I always considered what Ervand wrote in the introduction of Iran with Revolution. let me to recall it. Ervand says, it is to be hoped that future historians will be able to test my finding by gaining access to one of major sources left unused, the archive of the Soviet Union on Iran. So together with my colleagues and students, we have tried to bring Soviet archives for having a better and more comprehensive understanding of Iranian 20th century history. Now back to my comments and questions on Tudeh party's formation, from the Communist Party of Iran to Tudeh party. The question: why, following the Allied invasion of Iran in August 1941, when the Tudeh party was formed in October same year, there is no reference to the Communist Party of Iran, its possible revival or reemergence? So far, we have three explanations proposed by Tudeh party officials and activists, as well as scholars working on Tudeh party. The first one is, first explanation goes to the Comintern policy in 1941. We know that in the periodization of the Comintern history, the period 1941-43 is the period of anti-fascist war, which followed by the other period of anti-imperialist, period of Popular Front, and the rest. So Comintern called the period breaking ties with the Nazi Germany and joining the Allied as the anti-fascist period, calling all the communists all over the world for setting up Popular Front against Nazi Germany. Thus, Tudeh party was outcome of this Comintern new policy. This is the first explanation. The second explanation is that his reasoning goes to still prevailing at that time, the Iranian government's anti-communist legislation ratified in June 1931, banning the formation of any Communist Front organization. So because of that, we couldn't go back to the Communist Party of Iran. We set up the Tudeh party as a non-communist organization. So this is the second explanation. The third explanation, and finally, is that the Soviet endeavor to avoid any performance jeopardizing cooperation with the Allied partners, the British, and indirectly the United States. So in order not to jeopardize the relation, they didn't go, back to the Communist Party of Iran. Although there are some valid arguments in all these three reasonings, nevertheless, for me, none of them were convincing. Why? Because if I compare it with the fate of the communist parties in the region, for example, the TKP, the Turkish Communist Party, the outcome somehow was the opposite to what we have in Iran. Let me just very, very short to say that in the Republic of Turkey, during the authoritarian one-party regime and after years of the oppressive stance toward the political parties, in 1943, with the Soviet support, TKP began to come alive again, and later in 1946, when the Turkey transformed to multi-party system, Turkish communists founded two parties. One was that Socialist Party of Turkey, TSP, and the other one was the Socialist Labor Peasants Party, TSEKP. All these two were front of the Communist Party, but the still Communist Party of Turkey was there. So this is happening in Turkey. But when I dive into the Comintern archive in Moscow, Baku, and Tashkent, I find, and later on when I came across a very, very interesting documents on Iran desk of NKVD in a private collection, I realized that there was some other reason for the not Communist Party of Iran to be revived in this period, and that was indeed in the beginning the Soviets were eager. That was in their agenda to set up the Communist Party. But later, what we have a discussion in the Soviet Politburo, Anastas Mikoyan, then the full member of the Politburo, was indeed asked to go for this project of setting up the Communist Party of Iran. We know that Anastas Mikoyan with long experience being involved in the communist movement in Iran since the Jangali period. He knew more than anybody else about what's happening with the Iranian communists a few years earlier. I'm talking about the Stalinist purge of 1935-38. I have published letters sent to Mikoyan by Ehsan Allah Khan from the prison. So he knew what's happening to Iranian communists at that time. And then his reaction to the Politburo, the Mikoyan reaction is very, very vague and very reluctant to go to the project of the setting up the Communist Party of Iran. And then they decided to leave the Communist Party of Iran and go back to the Tudeh Party of Iran. The wounds was so deep in the chest of the party, the Communist Party of Iran, to be held at that time, because all the leaders were executed during the Stalinist period. So the Iranian side of the story, it needed also to be considered, because concurrently, even some weeks before that, before the foundation of Tudeh Party, we had a Communist Party cells in Tehran was founded, and in other major cities in Iran. These cells shouldn't be confused with the Khorezhek network, which was founded 2 years later in 1943. These were very genuine Communist Party cells in Tehran. The story of these Communist Party cells is too long, is another story, and I don't want them to bring to bring it here for discussion now and here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Touraj. Thank you. Ervand, do you have a response?
Yeah, no, not so much response. Actually, it's fascinating information. I mean, what the materials that one is getting. But, you know, how important the decision in Moscow was, this side or that side, relative to what was going on in Tehran. I mean, I would stress more in Tehran, someone like Iraj Iskandari, who was very important in the formation of the party, that he really wanted a broad front. He didn't want just a communist party, he wanted something broader. Of course, his uncle, Suleiman, was made chairman of the Tudeh party, and he had belonged to the Socialist Party, not the Communist Party. So I think that I would put stress that the early founders of the party had the aspiration of not being labeled as simply communist, but something broader, which then, of course, fitted into the Comintern policy of the time of the wartime policy of United Front Against Fascism. Actually, Skandari at one point has an interesting statement. He says he even tried to talk Mossadegh to come to the party meeting. So again, he was thinking in terms of bringing in people who did not have a past associated with radicalism, but much more as patriots. So all the factors may have come in, but the question is which one you put more weight on. But the more information we get from Soviet sources actually would be interesting. One thing recently I discovered in a source that when the Soviets invaded, really, they didn't even know who the 53 people were, Ajose and Afar. One usually overestimates the intelligence services of the Soviets as much as the Americans. They often were clueless about what was going on. And in the early Tudeh party, they may have been fairly clueless. I mean, there's often, the critics say, well, the founding meetings was done in the presence of some certain Aliyov. There's always an Aliyov that appears somewhere. Whether that's true or not, I would like to know from Soviet sources if there was a Soviet representative at the founding meeting of the Tudeh party.
Just very, very quick, response to what Ervand said. My comments on this formation of the Tudeh party was not A or B, or Tudeh party a front, a popular front at that time, or the Communist Party. There were arguments at that time we could have both Communist Party to be revived. In addition to that, another party, another front to the party. So that was another argument, going on. And the reason this scenario didn't work, because nobody was left from the Communist Party of Iran.
Thank you. Well, having had a student who did try and do some research in the Russian archives, it's certainly not the easiest thing to do, I have to say. And they were fairly selective from what it sounds and what they showed him. But there you are. There was a brief opening, I think, in the 1990s, but I think it's become much, much more difficult. So without further ado, going on now to Afshin, over to you.
Thank you, and I try to be short. So I'm the last one. I wanted to say that the historiography of the Tudeh party, which Professor Abrahamian Ervand pioneered in, not only placed one of the most important pages of modern Iranian history in the center, dragged it from, I've said, from the maligned margins to the front and center. And so it opened up a new path for Iranian historiography, but it also did something else. It also shook up and challenged historiographic foundations, the ways historians have been writing history of 20th century Iran, both Iranians and non-Iranians. It challenged really important assumptions, those of the Cold War and methodological nationalism. And so my question, I'm going to quickly make a few comments, but this is my question for Professor Abrahamian Ervand. When you were doing this, when you were doing the work that later on came out as Iran Between Two Revolutions, to what extent were you conscious that not only you're doing a groundbreaking work in the history of the Tudeh party, you are going to shake down historiographic kind of paradigms and creating a path for younger generation of historians, then younger, now people like me, older, who followed your path. And we are struggling with this paradoxical legacy of the Tudeh party and your work. And that is, we have a political party that's, by all accounts, 20th century Iran's most important political organization. What it accomplished during those 12 years, it was phenomenal. It started, as everybody said, as a product of a very specific moment in the global alignment of the history of the world at that moment. Anti-fascist front, the British and the Americans and the Soviets are allies. And so the Tudeh party is a pro-allies political organization. At the same time, it's constitutionalist within the framework of Iran. It's somehow social democratic, socialist leaning at least. And it's legal parliamentarian. And it creates very quickly a hegemonic bloc in, if you like, in the Gramscian style of fusing together the demands of Iran's new modern urban middle classes represented by the intellectuals or intelligentsia and those of the incipient industrial working class and the larger working people of Iran. It also plays a very important role, as Nasser said, in introducing the agenda for significant pushing of women's rights, the franchise. And yes, it's just at that moment, it's not a social movement, but it's the beginning of a demand that I have argued again by referencing Ervand's works and others, that the social reform agenda that the Tudeh party introduced becomes the hegemonic trend in political culture from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, all the way to the revolution. And it's paradoxical. The Tudeh party itself is suppressed and goes into exile. I think becomes a minor presence, but the political and ideological legacy it has established is vibrant and becomes a blueprint from which the Pahlavi regime copies its major social reform agenda, the White Revolution. Here I allude to the work of Ali Ansari. And it is paradoxical. I mean, a Stalinist political party, ultimately, it changes from that united front. It quickly becomes a party that at its core is Stalinist. If you want to use the word, unfortunately, subservient to Soviet whatever commands, demands. And I'm not saying it had absolutely no agency of its own, but it came down, it had to follow Moscow's line. And at the same time, that association with the Soviet Union, of course, again, as people alluded to, was an asset. In the beginning, it was not a liability. We can't understand that moment in world history. This is what Stephanie mentioned, that being associated with the Soviet Union was a reason of success of Tudeh's agenda in the beginning. Later on, it changes. It could become a liability, because this is part of the Tudeh party paradox, that you have this party that can function best in a semi-parliamentary constitutional context. The Tudeh party was never a revolutionary party in the sense of having plans to overthrow the existing political order and come to power. And I think that's why it so quickly folded in 1953. It didn't have a plan to resist something like that. And yet it was intolerable because its message, its accomplishment was so revolutionary politically to the context of Iranian reality. It was absolutely unacceptable to the power establishment in Iran. It was absolutely unacceptable to the British and the Americans increasingly for what it was doing to upset the political order in Iran, and also because of its association with the Soviet Union. So we have this paradox that has pulled all of these contradictory facets together, and it's clear that it still cannot be understood. It's still maligned and it's still attacked and misunderstood. And I'm a part of that new left generation that really struggled with understanding, well, what was this party of our fathers and mothers? Both of my parents were its members, so it wasn't just the fathers. But to understand that, and that challenge is still here, because I want to end by saying that the assumptions of Iranian historiography, Ervand, that you challenged, and tell us how deliberately were you doing this, or how consciously, are still here. Iranian historiography is still dominated by methodological nationalism, and unfortunately, even the assumptions of Cold War are still with us. So there you go. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Afshin. Ervand, over to you, please.
Well, in the 1940s, 50s, even 60s, much of the writing on Iran was, especially in the West, was basically in the context of international relations. You know, what was Iran's relationship to United States? Unfortunately, this has returned back, has become the dominant theme. But when I was studying, I was allergic to international relations. So I really didn't want to deal with, you know, foreign policy. I was trained as a social historian. So naturally, I wanted to look at Iran as a society. And since the Tudeh party was a social movement, and this became the natural topic to discuss. Of course, in the 60s, the history wars at that time were about to study from history below or history above, and it fitted into my interest from history below. I think that debate is no longer really that important. But in the 60s, it was important to look at any society, not just what's happening at the elite, but also in the public arena. So I don't think it was intentional or planned. It was more, I would say, something of that time of the late 60s that one gravitated. And it wasn't just me, of course, there were others of my generation who did the similar things. Fred Halliday was, of course, another one of that generation. But in terms of your last point about, generational conflict, I think that becomes very important, is to understand politics, not so much the arguments that are used, but what is the dynamics of conflict. So after 53, clearly when you have a setback in social movements in Iran, the young generation then obviously asks the question, who was at fault? And it's easy to say the reason it failed was because our fathers or mothers somehow failed their movement. And if we then have developed a dual formula, like in medieval alchemy, if you have the right combination of this and that, you're going to have a revolution. And the old generation didn't formulate the right formula. That's why they failed. So in the 1960s, 70s, the whole notion of the younger generation was that Iran was on the verge of a socialist revolution. And if you just got the right ingredients, put the right ingredients in, there was going to be a full-blown socialist workers system in Iran. And this was basically the discourse that was used in the old generation. So instead of looking at 53, why there was a coup, what was the balance of powers at 53, it was easy to say, oh, well, the leadership made all these mistakes. They didn't go for armed struggle. If they'd gone for armed struggle, we would never have had the Shah come back. It was easily basically arguments. But again, if you look at it, I think historically at the documents at the time, this was pure fantasy.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I wanted to ask the other members of the panel if they had any other final comments, particularly Stephanie or Nasser, if you had anything that you wanted to add before we move on. Any other questions? Nasser, you're muted. You're still muted.
Ervand, I agree with you that some of the founders of the Tashkilat Zanan Iran, they were relatives, sisters or wives of leaders like Najmeh Alavi or like Maryam Firuz, as you mentioned. But few of them were members of the Iranian Communist Party, like Jamileh Sadiqi, like Khanom Shermini, like Shoukat Rosta. They were remnants of the Iranian Communist Party. Few of them jailed during the Reza Shah. These were the first, women political prisoners of Iran. And then you had many independent women, who joined the Tashkilat Zanan Iran, because as you know, as long as Suleiman Mirza Iskandari was there, I mean, they wouldn't, they wouldn't accept a women's membership in the Tudeh party. It is after Suleiman Mirza's death that, women can become members of the Tudeh party. So when we look at, the Tashkilat Zanan Iran, like, for example, Bidari, the magazine Bidari, which we have almost all issues of the Bidari. Okay, it was run by women, everything was done in that, magazine by women, all articles, every decision that they would make. Of course, they were, influenced by the Tudeh party, but they had their own understanding of things. They had their independence in so many different ways, to do grassroots work in Iran, what you mentioned as one of the characteristics of the Tudeh party. So in terms of, and later on with the Sazman Zanan Iran, Women's National Organization, completely changes, even from the Tashkilat Zanan Iran. So the second phase of the women's, and they were really a genuine mass or grassroots movement with influence in working class women, middle class women. They were entering into alliances with other women's movements, totally independent from the Tudeh party. This is what I have understood from the practice of two different organizations, women's organizations of the Tudeh party. What we see later on, like the example that you raised with mentioned that with Maryam Firuz, well, in exile, a lot of people who were working, who were the founders, who were activists of the women's organization, were sidelined, marginalized, ousted by Maryam Firuz and her grouping. Okay, and this is very important because like a person like Malakeh Mohammadi would work in the peasants' organization of the Tudeh party, but would not work, with women's organization of the Tudeh party. And she was one of the foremost feminists of Iran of the time, okay? So I just wanted to raise this issue with you. Also, I'm not going to take much of the time because I think I talked too much. I would like you, Ervand, I would like to invite you to the session on Ruzbe, and I would like to talk about, the new findings that shows that it's very doubtful that Ruzbe, was the person, the mastermind. Of course, it was Abbasi, who killed. They say that they killed. The scenario that the Sabak made and Bakhtiyar made, and no one else has discussed this. No one else. We have no other source whatsoever, but the interrogations, and we know how the interrogations were made. And the Tudeh party itself, in the fourth plenum, they took a position later on. A report, as I'm sure that you're aware of, took a position that it has nothing to do with the Tudeh party or Khosrow Ruzbe. This is 1957. This is before Zibai's book on communism in Iran came out. But I'm not going to pursue this discussion no longer. I would like you to be there in that session, and I would really like to hear your comments, after I give my talk on this issue.
Can I, Stephanie? Did you want to have?
No, I think you should open it up for the Q&A.
Are you sure? As if you don't have anything else, and I don't know if Ervand, you had a specific response to Nasser's point there.
Yeah, there's no question there was a women's organization, and there were plenty of women who were active. But the word, I'm careful about using the word movement or social movement. And to do that, you really need large numbers of people. You can talk about the workers' movement. You're talking about the Central Council of Trade Unions. You're talking about 100,000 people, 200,000 people. When you're dealing with women's organizations, you're dealing with basically a very elite handful of people. It doesn't mean they're not important, but it's not a social movement. It's, I would say, I put it as an extension of the intelligentsia, women intelligentsia active in politics. But I think when you move up forward to 1970s, 80s, then you can really talk about a women's movement where you do get large numbers of people, especially in the Reform Islamist movement, active in politics.
Right, now, going over to questions, we do, as you can imagine, have a long series of questions. I'm going to, because of the limited time we have, I'm going to try and basically also try and collate a number of these into the themes that are coming out. And one of the stronger themes in the questions is really the link with Moscow and how much the Tudeh party was really an autonomous organization, or to what extent was it really being directed by Moscow and the limits. I mean, there's been a couple of questions here about, you know, how independent could it have been? How successful, could it have been if it had been independent from the USSR? Another question also on the role, which is a fascinating one, of the Trotskyist movement at the time and its relationship to the Tudeh party, which would be also fascinating. But tied to that again from I think a colleague of ours sitting in Moscow, as it happens, is basically this, you know, the relationship. In fact, I'll read this bit because it's quite interesting. It says, it's hard to imagine that between 1941 and 46, the Tudeh was able to afford ideological experiments without the knowledge and the sanction on behalf of the Soviets. At the same time, initially, there were some liberal and religious deviations from the Soviet official general line. So Dennis here raises the point you make, Ervand, in Tortured Confessions, that during the first year after the establishment of the Tudeh, there was a ban for female membership and a kind of appeal to religious Iranians via organizing Mohajer processions and providing praying rooms in Tudeh headquarters, as well as advocating of democracy and individual rights. So he wanted to really know, you know, what, in a sense, what were the links? How tight were the links? Could the Tudeh and its origins have operated without those associations? You know, how flexible were they? And there's one, obviously, because we can't miss this, but I think I know what the answer to this is, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is, you know, given that Russia was involved, or the Soviet Union, to be more accurate, was involved in the in certainly the early part of the Tudeh party's life, what were they doing in 1953? You know, where were the Russians at this time? Again, I think I know the answer to that, but I'll leave you to sort of to provide some insight. So Ervand, if I start with you, but then if the others, if the rest of you, if you just sort of raise your hand at particular times if you want to come in, and then I can, because we have many other questions too. So I want to try and get them all in.
Well, I wasn't really that interested about links between the Tudeh and the Soviet Union, partly because that's international relations. I was averse to that. Also, another reason is, of course, the documents. I wouldn't have access to Soviet documents. So, and the third thing is, I don't find it an interesting question. Obviously, on important issues, the Tudeh party took same side as the Soviet Union. But whether on every daily basis the Soviet Union was telling the Tudeh you have to do this or that, I think it's sort of a waste of time. I'm sure they were not interested in micromanaging the Tudeh party on a daily basis. But on important issues, for instance, when the Sino-Soviet dispute came, obviously the Tudeh party was not going to take didn't have the freedom to take a Chinese position on that. On crucial issues, they would obviously toe the Soviet line. So there's nothing ready to investigate there. And also, actually, the obsession about the links is a sort of an obsession of the Cold War. So if you're still merged in the Cold War, then this might be important, because then you're trying to find out who's a spy, who's an agent. And the reverse is, of course, looking at the Iranian political scene and trying to find who's actually linked to MI6 or CIA or the French intelligence. There has to be always a link, and you have to explain people's policies by those links. So I shied away from the whole topic of the links. But on a broader basis, you know, what were the Soviets doing in '53? Basically, doing nothing. And is this surprising? Now, if you start with the premise that ever since Catherine the Great, the Soviet Union has, the Russians have been having their eyes on Iran and trying to get to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. If that is the premise, then you're obviously constantly thinking that the big bear from the north is moving south and wanting to move south. And that's the Cold War discourse on Iran, is always that idea of the bear is always plotting to take over Iran. And this fits in, of course, with the conservative Iranian notion that the threat comes not from Britain or United States, but from the North. Now, the trouble with that premise is that you have long periods after 1921 when the Soviets are really not interested in Iran. They basically, as long as there are no American or British bases in Iran, they're more than happy to let Iran be a neutral state. That was the premise of the 1921 agreement. As long as Iran agreed, basically accepted that premise, the Russians really took no interest in Iran. So we have the minutes of the discussion between Molotov and Ribbentrop in the Nazi-Soviet pact. There, the Nazis keep on telling the Russians that, look, Britain is finished. Why don't you have your aspirations to the Persian Gulf? And Molotov keeps on bringing the issue to the Baltic and Eastern Europe. The Soviet interests, from their point of view, their vital interests were Eastern Europe and the Baltic. And it was the Germans who kept on saying, look down there. At one point, actually, Molotov is rude at Ribbentrop, and apparently it's the first time the foreign diplomat was rude at the Nazi leaders. They were basically in a bomb shelter because the war has started. The British were bombing them, and they were in a bomb shelter. And Molotov said, well, if the British are finished, why are we in this bomb shelter? Their interest basically in Iran was very limited. They came into Iran because of the British wanted it very much, and of course the route. They were more than I think would have been happy to leave Iran in 1945, except for when they discovered that the Americans or the British were going to get an oil concession in Azerbaijan. So that basically prompted the Azerbaijan crisis. But interesting, when the Azerbaijan crisis ended and the Iranian army moved into Azerbaijan, the Russians didn't react. And this actually was intriguing for the Americans here. The Russians are actually not reacting. Similarly, when the oil crisis started, the Russians really didn't take much interest. This was seen as a conflict between Iran and Britain. They weren't involved. And then to add to that, when Mossadegh nationalized the Shilat, the fisheries, the CIA was hoping that the Russians would react strongly, and here there would be another crisis. The Russians took it very well. They said, fine, you want to nationalize, here it is, here's the oil company. So again, they were not that interested. So I think when it came to 53, it fits into their whole attitude that Iran was a peripheral interest to them, as long as there was no American or British military bases there. In fact, another recent document that came out from the State Department is in 53, when the British and the Americans were arming the Qashqai's, the Boer Ahmadis, Bakhtiaris. The CIA was intrigued that the Russians weren't interested in the Kurds, because for them, the natural place for the Russians to arm would have been the Kurds, and they said they were actually not interested, and they couldn't figure out why. Well, they couldn't figure out why because their premise was wrong. I think their premise was that Russia was always interested in Iran. But if you take the reverse notion, it fits into their lack of interest. Due research in the Molotov papers actually is interesting. The Shah in 51 writes to Molotov saying the British and Americans are very interested in Iran. Why are you not interested in Iran? Why are you just basically ignoring us? And then Kashani writes a similar letter to Molotov, take more interest. And again, I don't know what Molotov's response was, but again, this is an indication that they were not really interested. It's also intriguing, but since people like the Shah considered Russia as a big bear, hungry bear that is always willing to gobble up Iran, why is he poking the great bear and saying, you take more interest in me? Well, they were not actually, had other interests to pursue. So I think the whole issue about Soviet Tudeh links is really, I think, red herring, basically. It avoids the real issues and interesting issues in Iranian society.
Thank you. Is there anyone? Well, Afshin, you want to pop in there?
Oh, I just want to put this question out there, and because I anticipate this question as an undercurrent, and that is for Professor Abrahamian. I can imagine members of the audience or whoever, or myself, thinking, what would be your fundamental criticism of the Tudeh party? What was it that perhaps contributed to its weakness or defeat, or what was it that they did wrong, do you think?
At what period?
Well, I mean, more overall strategic, not tactical. They made, I'm sure you'd say they made many mistakes, but if they are thinking of, I think so far, we have been thinking to reverse, the prejudice and misunderstanding about the Tudeh party. We have tried to set the record straight about kind of removing false accusations and the problems that they didn't have. But what do we think, or what do you think was their fundamental strategic weakness or mistake? I want to pose a challenging question.
Well, actually, I think underlying your question is, again, I think what I think the generational thing of alchemy. Somehow, if the alchemy was right, then you would have a right situation. I would put it another way. What was this basically Iranian society? Was it feasible to have a revolution either in the 40s or 50s or 60s? And if you look at the basic context, no alchemy could have produced gold out of that. You're having basically base metals and no type of conjuring or medieval incitations is going to transform base metals into gold. So like in 1953, the notion that somehow if the Tudeh party had played it right, they would have brought out a revolution rather than a coup. If you look at the new documents again, the possibility of that was just not existent. Even the CIA that publicly claimed that Iran was about on the verge of revolution, and many of us actually were misled somehow by what the discourse was in 53, that the country was on the verge of a revolution because the Americans, the British claimed the country was on the verge of a revolution. The Shah claimed that the communists were able to take over, that there was a real possibility of a socialist revolution. A lot of the younger generations, when I started, I sort of basically bought that line. But if you look at the documents now, even the CIA documents, that is completely off the wall. The CIA documents themselves basically say that the Tudeh party has no chance of coming to power. There's a document of CIA written just 10 days before the coup. And this is a coup that was supposed to carry out a coup to prevent a communist coup. The CIA clearly, categorically says the communists are not in a position to take over power. They're numerically weak. They're basically concentrated in the cities. They are not armed. They're not prepared to talk about a revolution. They're basically talking about supporting Mosaddegh. So it's all a facade, which many people then took that facade to be reality. And the punchline they often give is Iran like Czechoslovakia, that Iran was going to go the way of Czechoslovakia. And they even nowadays use that, the royalists use that argument. It's bizarre. You compare Czechoslovakia to Iran is like, completely different worlds. Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party and its allies had over 50% of the population. In Iran, in elections, the Tudeh party got to 2.3% of the electorate. You're talking about 50. In Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party controlled all the major ministries, security, media, police. Much of the army was trained by the Red Army. All they had to do was literally push Masaryk out of a wall, out of a window, and you had a coup. In Iran, the CIA shows that however powerful the Tudeh was to organize demonstrations, organize petitions, it was in no position to carry out a coup or a revolution. So its importance or its size was overblown by its opponents. And of course, the party itself, I think, like any party, tends to exaggerate its importance. It didn't try to minimize it. And we ended up by saying, well, it's a huge party. It was the biggest party, so why didn't it succeed? Well, in fact, in reality, it was not in a position to succeed. As Mosaddegh said in his trial, the Tudeh party didn't have even a single tank or a single machine gun. How is it going to take over power? At that time, we often forget, the Americans had over 10,000 armed Qashqai's. The British had even more among the Bakhtiaris and Boer Ahmadis. So if I look in Czechoslovakia, I don't remember any tribes armed by the British or the Americans that were going to challenge the communists. So balance of power was completely imbalanced. And the whole notion that somehow the Tudeh party, if it had played right, it could have pulled off a revolution in 1953 is just, I think, imaginary. It's medieval alchemy.
Can I just clarifying? I didn't mean for them to pull off a revolution. I meant they might have dropped their allegiance to the Soviet Union, joined Mossadegh, become a constitutionalist, socialist-leaning Iranian party. That could have been a different line. It wasn't impossible. That was the cause of the major defections from them, the criticism from the left. Maybe they couldn't have corrected that line. I'm not expecting a revolution. I was expecting them to stay the course that they had started. I think that would have been an option, but they didn't take it.
Well, of course, in August 53, they were supporting Mossadegh fully. And I don't know if that was against Soviet policy or not, but whether they had been more supportive, that I don't know if that would have prevented a coup. But I think, again, it was really border issues that brought down the coup, not their tactical deciding to do this or that. And as far as I could figure out, that the Soviets by August 53 were supporting Mossadegh. So I don't think that was a factor in the coup. In fact, I think one of the reasons for the coup was that the Mossad was getting closer to the Soviet Union. The negotiations with the Soviet Union started in the summer of, the coup was August. About 3 months before that, there were hot discussions between Moscow and Tehran.
Stephanie.
Yes, it's just really, Afshin already said something along the lines that I was thinking about, but when we look at this issue of the Tudeh strategy, it's clear, I think, that in the 1950s, the objective conditions were spectacularly unfavorable. There's no doubt about that. But it is nonetheless the task of a political party to formulate a strategy which advances its interests in the medium to long term. And the Tudeh party doesn't seem to have done that in the 1950s. Of course, it wasn't probably capable and there was no opportunity of it leading a revolution, but a strategy which enabled it to maintain some sort of influence in the country, it seems to me was the Tudeh party found this very, very problematic. And that not only was there a coup, but it was itself destroyed practically inside the country. So I'm just wondering, as Afshin in his second comment, okay, no revolution, very difficult conditions, but what should they have done, which would at least have enabled them to maintain their credibility inside the country? Is it just impossible to think of this, do you think, or can we begin to start to think about alternative strategies in the period?
Yes, I mean, that's why I think that the internal documents are important to get to, because we don't know all the discussions that took place between 49 and 52, because that's where I think there is the real, mistakes made, which was when the nationalist movement started, the oil nationalization. From 49 till 52, the Tudeh was critical of Mossad, of the campaign. And this, in fact, then created a gulf between the nationalist movement and the Tudeh movement. So I would like to know that in the discussions, who was basically arguing against Mossadegh, who in favor. And this is often used, I think, misused to explain the coup. It doesn't explain the coup because by 53, the Tudeh party had changed its policy and was fully supporting Mossadegh. So the examples people give of the Tudeh criticizing Mossadegh are from the earlier period. Historians tend to fudge it as if that was continued all the way to the 53. But there was a shift basically in 53, probably after Siatir in July of 52. And why this shift took place, who was basically instrumental with it. And here maybe the Soviets are important. These we don't know inside the discussions what happened. Clearly, I would say the biggest mistake was the failure to understand the oil nationalization campaign, what it was. And they interpreted it as a sort of American attempt to undermine the British rather than a real nationalistic movement. And that, in fact, gave them this big disadvantage when it came to dealing with Mossadegh, and also in the whole nationalist movement. But this is, again, something that really we need to get into the internal party archives to discover what really happened. And we might find and discover that personalities who were actually often rivals on this issue were actually allied. So it wasn't the personality of egos that determined what people said. It was actually what their evaluation of the situation and their own commitments were. But that's something I don't know, but I would love to know how people voted there.
Touraj, do you have a small point? Because I want to get to some other questions, if that's...
Just very small. I mean, I did
Go for it.
go for the labor movement because I've got my comments on the Tudeh party and labor movement. I avoid here only, I mean, on reaction to Afshin's point. I mean, there's two episodes I want to bring it. One is when we have the concession of the oil of the North proposed by the Soviet Union. That was the best time for the Tudeh party to apply a negative equilibrium like the Mossadegh later, neither to Soviet nor to the British. That was the best policy, not bringing the people to the street supporting the oil concession. That was really made a problem within the Tudeh party. The second, point, that Tudeh party, created a problem was that dissolving in 24 hours, less than 24 hours, dissolving all the parties' branches in Azerbaijan and giving up to the Peshawari.
Yeah, and of course, that's what I was mentioning. One of the areas we really need to have materials of discussions in the Central Committee when they were suddenly hit by the fact that the oil demands were made. Actually, just a week before, Radmanesh in the Majlis had talked about basically nationalization of oil industry, and suddenly there was the demand for the Soviet. Again, of course, if you do it isolated that, then you don't have a bigger picture that the Americans and the British were also trying to get an oil concession in Azerbaijan at the same time.
So I just want to get a few more questions in. I mean, cognizant of the time. So here's a very good one. What do we know about the Tudeh's plans for recruitment of members and attracting sympathizers in and through the school system? Do we have any idea of what the methods used, if they had any, to be honest, through the school system, Ervand, or anyone else?
Well, they had a youth organization, and basically the materials they used would have been the same about, the same themes. I don't think they were special. Oh, of course, they were interested in athletic stuff, sports. So that would have been a good way to get to youth. So, but in terms of any outstanding or peculiar things, I haven't seen any of that. I don't know, our panelists may have more to say about that.
Does anyone else have a? Well, that's a pity, but maybe that's obviously something for work to be done. But nobody else seems to have. Afshin, go for it.
It certainly had the youth organization that reached to high school students, but I wouldn't bet on them kind of trying to get into the minds of Iran's kindergarten, children. You have to be a little careful. Those nefarious plans only go.
You muted yourself, Afshin, at the moment you said nefarious plans. So
I just said they're nefarious.
Something was.
I wouldn't push it all the way down to kindergartens and that far.
I thought there might be this sort of Gramscian model of a hegemony taking place and controlling all the organizations of education and culture and other things. Another question that is, if I can just locate it here, is really also about transnational links with the Indian communists, but also with the anti-fascists in Spain and other things. I mean, has there been any work done on the sort of the international links of the Tudeh party and how they sort of extended? Particularly, I suppose, the Indian communists would be quite interesting. I mean, if there were, I don't know if there were any.
If I may,
yeah, sure. Who wants to go ahead? Who wants to start? Ervand, did you want to start?
Well, I don't know about Indian or there's with the British Communist Party there was, but I think their strongest links would have been with the Iraqi Communist Party for obvious reasons. And some of the people who organized the labor in Ahvaz, Abadan, actually went back and forth to across the border. So there was, I think, close connections all the way to the 1980s.
I have published about the Indian Communist Party's link with the Tudeh party in 1940s, and there is good enough documents in Delhi's archive about the activities of the Communist Party in Khuzestan.
So there were sort of these transnational links, I take it.
Yes.
Right. Now let's see. Anyone else with the did I hear anyone else with any comment? Nasser, Stephanie? No. Nasser, your room has gone very dark, but now what other questions? Someone has a question here saying why, well, curious to know what the basis, why the Tudeh party continued to support the Islamic Republic after 1979, despite the sort of the, even when it went against their stance and beliefs. Why do you, what's the, what do you think the cause is? I mean, what was going on there?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, do start that off, Ervand.
I mean, the avowed reason was that the Islamic Republic was anti-imperialist, anti-American, and as long as it was anti-imperialist, it would have to be supported. So that was the main argument. But I think on the context, I think here again, perceptions and how far perceptions will face reality, conform to reality. The perception, I think, with Kianuri and the leadership was that the country would be on the verge of a civil war, that a civil war was likely. And in that civil war, then the sides would be those against America, pro-America, and therefore it would be best to have some sort of links with the Khomeini because of the civil war. It would be like a Spanish type of civil war. That would be the role to play. I think, again, this was, of course, this was not a perception just among Kianuri and the Tudeh party. There was a great deal of fear in 79, 80 that Iran was going to break up into a civil war. Because usually after a revolution, you have a counter-revolution, you have some sort of Vendée or uprising, and this would be the expectation. We now know, with hindsight, with history and documents, that that possibility was not there. It's just a false premise. There was no possibility of a counter-revolution, and the US was not in any way interested in sending an army into Iran to start a civil war. So the premises were wrong, but the arguments were that basically this regime was weak, fragile, could be overthrown, and therefore had to be supported despite all its faults. And of course, its faults all ran counter to early ideology of the Tudeh party, which was, of course, in terms of secularism and getting religion out of politics.
Is there anyone else wanted to come in at all? Nasser, just mind you're muted. You're muted. Still muted. Still muted. There you are. Good.
Okay, permit me to add to what Ervand said. Like, it's interesting because when the White Revolution happened and ensued the June 5th uprising in Tehran and other cities and major cities in Iran, okay, there was a discussion, you know, put forward by the Tudeh party. I mean, the Shah characterized the reaction, the 15th of Khordad, June 5th uprising as a reactionary movement, okay? Irtija Siyah, that was black reaction, okay? You read the نامه مردم and the discussions put forward by the Tudeh party, they were hesitant supporting the 15 Khordad movement. I mean, they changed positions a few times, even with Ayatollah Khomeini, because, you know, they were, I mean, there is this clear tendency there that these forces, the clergy, the Iranian clergy, and their supporters, I mean, first of all, they're in a relationship with the Iranian feudal lords. That is the term that the Tudeh party was using, feudal lords. And so this movement, you know, is attacking, you know, a step that is, we cannot support. The Tudeh party was saying it's not, you know, white revolution is nothing, you know, real big or anything, but it is a step in terms of modernization of Iran and in terms of, you know, changing the structure of the Iranian society. Okay, there is this background. And this background, you know, right a few months, you know, before the Iranian revolution, you have Iskandari. He wrote in the World Peace magazine, the organ of the communist parties, denouncing, you know, Khomeini, that, you know, no way we are going to enter into a relationship with, you know, Khomeini and support him. So there is this line, you know, that was being presented by Iskandari and Radmanesh. And then there was this another line, you know, with their own understanding of anti-imperialist struggle. And then, you know, we see that how, you know, Iskandari's line, you know, is marginalized, sidelined, and then Kianuri takes over with the support of the Soviets, clear support of the Soviets. So that makes you think that, you know, this wasn't something inevitable, you know, for the Tudeh party, you know, to come and, you know, support a force that we know, like, you know, the questions that you rightly pose, that these are the things that we do not know and we want to know, you know, the discussions within the Central Committee, the Politburo of this Tudeh party, what was going on, you know, with, you know, so many different things and important questions of the time. And of course, this is one of the questions. It would be nice to know what they were discussing, you know, before, you know, kicking out Iraj Iskandari from the leadership of the Tudeh party and giving, you know, the helm to Kianuri.
Did you want to respond, Ervand, or
Yeah, I mean, the land reform issue is actually interesting. As Nasser said, the Mardum at that time actually quite favorable to the land reform. And it's I've heard the possibility that the Tudeh party was willing to fully support land reform if they were given the opportunity to function in Iran, i.e. there was some opening permitted so they could function. So they were willing to make a deal. And this, of course, some people could say, oh, this is a sign of opportunism and revisionism and reformism. But I think there was a desire for the Tudeh party to support land reform if it was willing, if it got something in return. But again, here, the decisions were made outside the Tudeh party. It was the Shah who didn't want to have anything to do that. The Shah wasn't willing to make a deal where the Tudeh could function, even if the Tudeh supported land reform. So the real decision or the burden was really on the Shah's shoulders. The new documents actually show something else that I was surprised. At some point when the Euro-communism was very big, the Shah had heard that the Tudeh wanted to move from East Germany to Italy and work with the Italian Communist Party. And this really created panic in the palace. And the Shah asked the CIA to inquire into this because he seemed to be more scared that the Tudeh party would be Euro-communist rather than dependent on the Soviet Union, which leads one to think about what was the real issues there. But clearly people like Iskandari, and there were others who would have preferred to work with Euro-communism rather than dependent on the Soviet Union. But in terms of the change from Iskandari to Kianuri, again, since I don't have the materials, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that it was the Soviets who determined that change. You have to look at the mood of the country and memberships of the exiles in 78, 79, when there's a whole mood of revolution, upheaval, unpredictability, who is considered by rank and file members, activists, is a man of the time. Someone like Iraj Iskandari, who is basically a lawyer, parliamentarian, traditional politician, or someone who's more of a maverick, who's been in the past associated with action rather than thinking and intellectual work. And Kianuri seemed to have fitted in that role. So I think it was a bit, Kianuri would have got probably a membership, an election membership support rather than Iskandari, although Iskandari, I would say, had a better record in politics, but Kianuri was clearly more a man who fitted the mood of 78, 79.
So I have a question that I'm now, which may be our last question. So apologies to those who have asked a series of questions and we haven't got round to that. But of course, the conference goes on for a couple of days anyway. So you may get opportunities later to ask your question. But here is, so this is quite, actually this will involve both Afshin and Ervand, I think, principally. But based on your Ervand, based on your statements and Dr. Matin-Asgari's question, would you say that the worst mistake of the Tudeh party would have been their shift from class politics to their discourse of anti-Westernism? What do you say to that, Ervand? And anyone else, by the way, who wants to chip in?
Well, I'm not sure actually the Tudeh party shifted that. Gharb Zadagi was not an idea that the Tudeh party advocated. It's much more leftists outside the Tudeh party, and especially the Shariati supporters that adopted Ahmad's Shariat, Gharb Zadagi. So I don't think that was a worse mistake. It's interesting that people are constantly asking, what are the mistakes? Again, it's going back to alchemy.
Afshin, since you are also in the...
A quick addition, yeah, all right. I think it's not just alchemy, but I think we have to have a kind of a balance sheet. And I can just tell you what I think. I think the greatest mistake was not being able to be independent from the Soviet Union, to be a popular mass party in Iran that was socialist or left-leaning. And I think that the moment of correction would have been in 1945, the Azerbaijan Crisis. If the Tudeh party, and that was, by the way, the cause of their splits, and Khail Maliki and all others, if they could have said that, no, we are a socialist-leaning, constitutionalist, popular Iranian party, but we make our own decisions, and we don't agree, for example, with what's happening in Azerbaijan. That would have made a major difference. And if they had followed that line, when the National Front would have been formed, they could have joined it. They could have been a socialist party in the National Front. I think their greatest strategic mistake was the lack of having enough wherewithal, politically to make their own decisions. And that left the party open to kind of a strategic confusion. They didn't do anything in 1953 because the Soviets didn't know what to do.
Touraj?
On the question of from leadership from Iraj Eskandari to Kianuri, my finding is that this move supported and proposed by the Soviet authorities. Kianuri, before taking over, met with Gholam Yahya Daneshyan in Baku, and Gholam Yahya Daneshyan had a good support of the Soviet Union and good contact with the Politburo. So on the advice of, on the support of Gholam Yahya Daneshyan, he would manage to push Iraj Eskandari back and get the power.
Ervand, did you have anything to come back on any of those, or?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's partly true, but also I think the rank and file membership in the time in 78, late 78, early 79, it was this whole euphoria about revolution, and that basically the future was around the corner. So, someone like Eskandari was more down to earth and I think much more cautious. It just wouldn't have fitted into the rank and file membership mood. I'm not sure, I'm not saying they're right or wrong. It's just the mood of that time. If you go back, how people were hilarious about what was going to happen. Someone like someone like Kianuri, who's more of an adventurist and was also associated with Rouzbeh, and people seemed like the person who would be a man of action that would fit in. There.
And coming from the clerical background.
Yeah, of course, but except for his father had another reputation, he had an anti-clerical background, so it goes by both ways. Do
you have any comments, Stephanie?
I'd like to go back to Afshin's argument. Again, here it's rather seeing mistakes of the Tudeh party. It's more being a victim of basically outside forces. Sure, in 1946, when the Russians made the demand for oil and then the Azerbaijan crisis, you could say rationally it would have made sense for the Tudeh party to declare independence, become an independent socialist party, and then basically become a major force. The problem with that argument is, of course, it was done. Khalid Maliki did that. And where did Maliki end up with? Khalid Maliki didn't cut much ice with the public. He didn't create trade unions or a mass movement. He basically created a small fragment that actually had to work with the most despicable elements in Iranian politics, Zahmat Keshan party. And again, the new documents revealed that the so-called Titoists were actually in the pay of the CIA. So that route basically led to the cul-de-sac of Niroy Sevom and Khalid Maliki. So I think that there is much more going on, that to have a socialist party in Iran that would be anti-Soviet would have actually not cut much ice at that time. Rationally, you could say, well, here again, the right ingredients were there. You put the right ingredients, socialism, national independence, and you get basically success. It wouldn't have worked that simply.
Stephanie, you're muted.
Just very quickly, as I think Fred Halliday pointed out a long time ago, the problem that the Tudeh had was similar to the problem that the Polish Communist Party had, which is just too close to the Soviet Union. I mean, the lack of any kind of geographical distance is also reflected politically and ideologically. And some problems are not necessarily soluble. You know, some things are just very difficult to find a way out of. And so I think this, the question of the Tudeh's relation to the Soviet Union is not quite as easily solved, maybe as Afshin put forward, because the Tudeh did benefit from its association with the Soviet Union as well as suffering from it. On the other hand, being an anti-Soviet party was not the only option. You had the non-aligned movement. We have the example of Tito in Yugoslavia, so you could be a communist party and also distance yourself from the Soviet Union. So I think this is, you know, it's slightly, there's more to say on this question.
Nasser, I'm going to give you the absolute final comment. Yep. But you're still muted, so that wouldn't be very final. Thanks.
Okay, following what Stephanie said, like, okay, the Tudeh party, what was the composition of the founders of the Tudeh party? First, you have Irani group. The Irani group, they were not going to, you know, I mean, it wasn't a blind obedience, you know, from the Soviet Union. They kept their independence from the Soviets. They were not anti-Soviet by no means, but they were an independent Marxist group, as you know better than me, okay? So we have this, you know, grouping, which is very important. This is most of the 53 nafar, the 53 are members of the Irani group, okay? Then you have remnants of the Iranian Communist Party, Ardashes and the rest, okay? And some people, you know, from the Jangali movement, you know, who were there, and some independent, you know, in the intellectuals. Khalil Maliki was one of the people, you know, from the Irani group, as you know, okay? So like, you know, what happened, you know, in 46, what is it in, you know, with the split, you know, of Khalil Maliki, a lot of people, you know, from the in the Tudeh party, including Ehsan Tabari, they were people, you know, who were criticizing the dominant line. There were many, you know, cadres too, you know, who were criticizing, you know, this line that, you know, we should follow the Soviets, you know, blindly, and, you know, with if it wasn't, you know, because of the position that the Soviets took, you know, with regard, you know, to the Khalil Maliki group, many of the people, you know, who were with Khalil Maliki would not have sided, you know, with Tudeh party. So this is again one of the things that, you know, when you think of, you know, how was this inevitable, that was it, you know, or what we're talking about is, you know, just illusions or, you know, wishful thinking, you know, it's not, you know, because there were these people, you know, who were saying that, okay, Tudeh party can play a very important role, meaningful role in the Iranian, you know, current events, you know, if it keeps its independence from the Soviets. So we shouldn't have been, you know, either, you know, completely anti-Soviet or, you know, completely, you know, pro-Soviet. We could, and this is still, you know, the question, you know, the independent line, being autonomous, you know, independent thinking, all the things that you mentioned, you know, with regard, you know, to the achievements of enlightenment.
So I think, Ervand, really strictly speaking, I should give you the opportunity of the final word if you wish to take it.
Yes, I mean, rationally you can say, well, look, all the things the Soviets did in 45 or 6, and there would have been rational to distance yourself from the Soviet Union. And these arguments, of course, were very quite prevalent in 1946-47. And Khalid Maliki epitomized that argument. And a lot of support, he got a lot of support actually from the Tudeh party. But in the long run, what you see is many of Khalid Maliki's original supporters actually went back to the Tudeh party and supported the Tudeh party. And Khalid Maliki's group was really become a very fringe group. So you could say he had all the right ingredients: socialism, credible background, nationalist. So instead, how come really Niruya Servom really never developed into anything? Most of the Sharia trade unions actually went back to the Tudeh party. He was reduced to a small group. So small a group, as I said, he had to work with the very despicable groups. And it now seems that they were basically funded by the CIA. So then that leads to the question, how come Iran could not produce a viable, independent socialist movement? Why the only one that they did exist was pro-Soviet? I have no answer, but that's basically what happened. And of course, I mean, you look at the Khalid Maliki, although it has impeccable, you could say, intellectual positions, some of their members of what they did is very, very dubious, actually. On the morning of 28 Mordad, their newspaper came out with a whole headline saying that the threat from the right wing, the army is finished. The threat now is from the Tudeh party. So here, basically, they were following the CIA line that, you know, the Tudeh is the major danger in 28 Mordad.
Although it wouldn't be, I suppose, unusual or unfortunate forever for many of these different parties and factions to turn on each other. I mean, would it? I mean, that's the sad history in some ways of many of these movements, that they dislike each other more than they dislike, you know, the main target, in a sense. So they you know, they then turn on each other. I mean, that's one of the unfortunate consequences in some ways of this political landscape, and obviously not unique to Iran at all. I mean, not unique to Iran.
It also actually is related to that is some of memoirs that come out. They have personal gripes, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt what they say. So you read someone who is, you know, depicts Kambash as a KGB agent and so on, and he's basically the bête noire. And then you discover actually when in his career, this guy who's writing his memoirs was actually very close to Kambash. So he is rewriting history. So much of personal politics comes in that
absolutely.
You have to be careful of that.
No, absolutely. It becomes very personal and very bitter and unusually vicious, actually, in some ways. Ideology, in some ways, excuses, I think, some of the more personal venom. Right. Well, I am going to now bring this, if I may, to a close. I think we've gone over by a good half an hour, and I wanted to thank our participants, in particular, Ervand, for being showing such stamina and energy in answering all these questions and really engaging with all the issues, along with all our panelists, Afshin, Stephanie, Nasser, Touraj. Thank you very much. I hope this opening lecture has whetted all your appetites for more. There is certainly more going through to Thursday. Please go to the website mihan.org.uk/Tudeh@80/ and you'll see the entire program there, in which a lot of these issues will be discussed, I'm sure, in a lot more depth. And maybe Afshin will be pleased to see that I might develop some sympathy towards the Tudeh party. I don't know. I mean, maybe give me a couple of days. You never know. So this is what may happen. Anyway, I wanted to thank you all once again. I want to thank the organizers, Siavush in particular, my good colleague here at St Andrews, who's put together a really quite stellar event with some excellent participants, and I know the attendance has been extremely good. We'd like to think that this time next year we'll all be together somewhere, and now we could all go out for dinner, but unfortunately we can't. So I'm going to bid farewell, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day wherever you happen to be in the world. I think Afshin has got a full day ahead of him, Ervand half a day ahead of him. The rest of us are going to bed.